All right, we'll give this a second to spool up. Let's make sure it's working. All right, and today, folks, if you're a random community member and not one of the students, just so you know, we're talking about drafting today. So if you ever want to write a research paper or know how you get to a decent length, that's what we're addressing today. And you'll get some of my wonderful graphics, and by wonderful I mean I basically reproduce my board work using MS Paint. So you know that's going to end really well. I just have a good feeling about that. And as normal, please ask questions in the Discord, either typed, let's make it smaller, typed questions in the Discord or typed questions in the Twitch. Both work. I'm actively watching both. Looks like the bitrate is stable enough. Good. All right. So today, if you're a student and you have your Turabian with you, we are literally going through Turabian. Let me move my keyboard. I don't think I need it that prominently. Okay, there goes the keyboard, and there's my T. Thank you, yes. The MS Paint legend. I mean, I don't know why you'd use any other software. Let's be honest. It's pretty easy. Oh, it's like a whiteboard, except slightly less functionality. Okay. Here we go. So drafting today. So if you didn't look at Turabian yet, now from today you definitely should. Trust me, you'll thank me later. Okay. So the one we already kind of talked about, but I want to remind you, if you're having trouble, it might be here. Oh man, it hit a key. Ugh, there we go. Of course it did. The keyboard's being finicky. He's sad I put him away. Come on. There we go again. Damn it, keyboard. Stop being emo. There you go. Okay. Now you're not hitting the top of something. Okay. Emo keyboard. Engage. Oh, nope. Yeah. Here we go. All right. So we're going to start with useful sources. Let me get my laser pointer. All right. So several people here, it's a little late to say this, but I'll bet money there's a good number of people here who haven't actually engaged their sources yet. And if you haven't, for the love of God, start today. Just start reading those introductions, the conclusions, and the chapters that seem relevant. Okay. Now, knowing what kind of sources you need is super important. Now, we already talked about the where you look, but how do you tell the difference between sources? The biggest difference here is you got to figure out which ones have actual data and which ones are interpreting data, and then which ones are interpreting other people's interpretations of the data. That third one is the worst, by the way, and we'll get into those differences in a second. Now, Turabian has some really interesting bits here that you should not skip. For example, how to record your citation information fully and accurately. This is 49. If you have the book, she has a great little structure. I'm actually going to show you the picture. Ooh. And if I had not already developed my own in grad school, this is the one I would have used. So this is how, let's make sure it shows up in the stream, this is how Turabian she gets little 3x5 cards. And for every source she finds an interesting bit, she just makes a 3x card. She'll read the source and then make this 3x5 card for the thing she's making. So for example, she'll say the source is the author, right? The title, the page number. What's it's related to, and then she'll do the claim, right? What are they arguing? So here, swearing became an economic issue. What's the data? Specific data, not general data. And then, what's the supporting info, complications, and questions you have? If you make these for all your reading, literally all your writing is organizing your 3x5 cards and then extrapolating. If you don't do this till later, oh my god, it gets a lot harder. I recommend doing some system like this early. My system's a little different. It's evolved. I used to just do handwritten notes on pages of paper, and then I evolved to I have little journals that I write in with my questions, and now I do some combination of journals, paper notes, and little post-it notes. So whatever system works for you, this system's great. I wish I would have heard about this. This is how I'd recommend notating as you read. So write as you read. Even this little bit, right? This is only a couple sentences, but if you keep track of where you find interesting questions and interesting data, it's so much easier later. It's so much easier. And this it's quicker. You can run through things. Try it. It helps, I promise. If you haven't done this yet, though, start looking. And in this chapter 2, she says, determine your citation style. We are definitely doing Chicago style, which is also known as Turabian style, which is the author of this book. Oh my goodness. Now, if you look at Jansen, he already does Turabian. But in our book, we have more data. It's chapter 18, 159, Chicago style. And if you look at it, it's exactly Jansen. So if you're like, how do I do Chicago style? Please look at Jansen. We'll get into this more next class, though. All right. So, next one. Search for sources systematically. Again, you should have already been doing this, but let's say you're having trouble. In the old days, it says talk to reference librarians. By the way, you can still email reference librarians. I'm not sure how good they'll do. That's you have to try. But also, skimming specialized reference works helped, like a dictionary, an encyclopedia of philosophy, or a concise English dictionary of literary terms, that kind of thing. There's a lot of historic dictionaries too. Search your library catalog. We already looked at how to do that. Browse the shelves. We already did that. So in general, you should be start looking for sources. And remember, all the good books should also have sources in them that you can use. Think of Jansen, right? Any good book should have a great bibliography and footnotes section that you're using. Okay, now, then you have to evaluate this one before you start writing fully. And as you're making those little 3x5 cards, you have to evaluate the sources for relevance and reliability. Just because it's a source doesn't mean it's a good source. A lot of you ran into this problem with your proposals. Why? I hit you really hard for news sources. Because news is not research. It's actually the opposite of research a lot of the time. Now, if modern news actually did on-the-ground reporting, it could almost be primary data. I say almost. Why not is primary data? A lot of news is propaganda. And by propaganda, it means they're pushing their own ideology, so they'll selectively find... They're not very scientific about their data collection, let's just say it that way. So you have to use news with a very, very fine grain of salt. If a news is a majority of your sources, your paper sucks. I can tell you that already. Now, you need data that you can use as evidence for your argument. And we'll recapitulate today what argumentation is. But you need data to use as evidence. If you don't have any data, your paper's just... you're not doing it. Also, you need a discussion of matters you plan to discuss. Like, how are you going to break your topic down? Especially introduction, right? Like, how are you going to organize your paper? Also, you need arguments that show how you and others are thinking about your question. It's not just your opinion. How are the authors you're reading arguing it, right? Like, what's in the field? What is the argument happening around this? Those are all very relevant. Now, the Turabian talks about the 3 kinds of sources, and normally I'd write this on the board. So instead, we're just going to do this thing I made today. So, okay, there's 3 kinds of data, right? So first, you have primary, secondary, and tertiary. So depending on the field, if you ask people what they mean by primary, secondary, tertiary, it's different levels of data. So for example, in the science, primary data is just the first one. Data from the source. That's primary sources. Pure data. And then secondary is extrapolations from the data, and tertiary is talking about the extrapolations of the data. Now, in the humanities, specific research in the field, again, based on primary data, is also in here. First-hand reporting can also be a primary source, as long as it's scientifically done. That just means it's not just agenda-driven or advocacy or political, but it actually is trying to falsify a hypothesis. That can be primary data. Now, secondary would be collection of research. Even a collection of primary research is entering the realm of secondary. So for example, Jansen's textbook we read could be a tertiary book, and it could be a secondary book, depending on your perspective. But a collection of research tend to be secondary sources, or research in a field where you draw on other people's research to make a bigger point, like a whole book. Those tend to be secondary in a lot of fields. Again, it depends on the field, but this is generally how you talk about it. Now, tertiary, these are the worst ones. This is encyclopedias and newspapers and general history books. Now, before we talk about the reliability of these, spoiler, what is your research paper? Your research paper is not a general history book. It is not an encyclopedia entry. It is not a newspaper. It is this one. It's research in a specific field. And because of our time constraint, right, you don't have enough time to do primary research. You're not collecting data on your own, right? Now, you could work from other people's data, but you are not collecting it. Does that make sense? So you're doing research in your field, drawing on primary sources of data, and sometimes secondary data. Now, obviously there's a continuum here, and primary is the most relevant and the best to make arguments from. Tertiary is the worst. And of these, newspapers and encyclopedias are by far the worst. If you rely on only newspapers, there is something wrong with your argument. I'm going to be honest, and you probably should reevaluate. Where's the note that Turabian made? I'm looking for this very interesting note. And Turabian has an interesting part here where she talks about why you'd want to use each. So, for example, primary sources are for evidence. Secondary sources are to learn about your topic. Tertiary sources are just for introductory overviews. So if you use these for a main argument, spoiler, at least two of you probably will, if history teaches me anything, this is just an introduction. You can't get from an introduction to research in a field. It doesn't work that way. It goes this way, not that way. So if you only use tertiary sources, I'll know it. If you try to make a secondary argument from tertiary sources, it will suck, I promise. You have to use primary and some secondary sources to make your secondary argument. Now, this is where we're going to do a little MS Paint aside. Let me get my graphics. Okay, really quick. Okay, I made a graphic. So somebody was asking me, okay, this is what we're trying to do, right? So what's the level of argumentation we're doing in a paper? And actually it correlates to that graphic I just showed you. This is the wonderful MS Paint thing I made. I don't see my zoom function, but the resolution's fine. Okay, so when you're doing your paper, there's different levels. So the first level is down here, right? Just like the primary sources. But your paper needs data and facts first. So it should be a slash, but I didn't put it in there. I'll put it in later. This is just what we can observe from reality. This is the data. It's not opinion. It's what happened. That's where you got to start. Now, the data naturally leads us to analyzing causes, right? So this is effects. So then the causes are the reasons it happens, the why. This is where your thesis is. So you have to ask, what is the cause for the thing we observe? We know observable reality, so what caused it? And this is where academics, these three levels, actually there's a fourth secret level I'll tell you about. These levels are where academics basically have their fight, although nowadays we're actually fighting about data too, which is really depressing. So at the very least for a good paper, you need the data and the facts, and you need the cause. Now, in your conclusion, or if you're writing like a whole book, and you had several chapters of data and causes, part of your book could be morals. Why should it be different? Or why is the way it is good? Right? Those are both moral statements. Moral statements. You cannot go from data to morals. You need data, and then the reasons, and then how that affects morals. Now, that's not the end. If you talk to people, they'll say it's the end. There's actually two levels above it. There's metaphysics, which is a structure of reality. So basically, how do the data and facts lead to causes, which lead to morals, which lead us to understand basic rules about the structure of reality? If you're like, Professor, this is intense. Oh, don't worry, there's another level above this. The level above this, where I left some room, which I'll add eventually, up here is theology. So the field would be theology, but then like, what's the structure of your, like, what's the origin of reality? That's the super intense philosophical pyramid. You don't have to go that far. We're mostly doing cause and data. That's research paper. And if your data and your reasoning leads to morals, that's fine. We literally talked about Mill and Marx. They both have moral and metaphysical frameworks. At the very least, I want you to use them to do the causal framework. But a little bit of morals at the end is totally fine. What's incorrect is if you go from data straight to morals. You can't do that. Why? Because you're not explaining me the logical cause and effect that leads to the should. You don't have a warrant for that. So this is a little graphic. You can rewatch the stream for it. I'll probably upload it somewhere too. And that is I'm going to remind you guys of this one. This is also from Turabian. It is not mine. I did not make it. Oop. There we go. How did that get moved? My God. Here we go. All right. So this is Turabian's. What would you call this? This is Turabian's basic structure for the argument. We already talked about this. This is from like chapter 2 or something. To remind you, your whole paper needs to be doing this, but every subsection of your paper also needs to do it. Every paragraph should do this, folks. You have to have your claim. You have to have your reasoning. You have to have your evidence. And then you have to acknowledge different views and respond to those views. And this is the explanation of it, right? If you do not have this, you are not doing a research paper. You are not doing an argument. If you only had evidence, you're doing a encyclopedia. If you only have reasoning, you're just doing logic. If you only have claims, you're just doing newspapers. You need all three of these for any kind of argument. So when we're saying argument, this is what we mean. You have to construct a logical construction from the data that's trying to prove the cause of things in reality. This is on page 21 if you want to look it up more. The whole chapter is called How Do Researchers Think About Their Answers and Arguments. If you're having trouble with arguments, this is where you got to go. So I'm just showing you this. All right, and we'll close that, and we'll close this. And just look at this later for a reminder. And again, I'm getting all of this from Turabian. So the more you focus on primary to make secondary arguments, the better your paper will be. And as normal, you can totally ask me questions before we move on. But yeah, like I said, today's going to be all Turabian, baby. I do not see any questions pinging. That's either wonderful or horrible. People are like, oh my god, I'm on the wrong path, or oh, I'm doing fine. But again, folks, this is what we're trying to do. So, just to make it super clear. All right, and if you can ask questions in media res too. As I'm going, if you have questions, please feel free to ask them. And yes, I like myself some good mecha, if you keep seeing my background. Mecha's great. All right, now chapter 5. Engaging sources. If you're anywhere, you got to be here. And engaging sources is on 57, is where I got that graphic earlier. This one. This is from engaging sources. So in one of her advice here, right, she says this, oh, let me give you the advice. Yeah, great. Oh, just minimize the self. So she has really good advice. So she says this: read generously to understand, then critically to evaluate. You have to do both. Don't just read critically. Don't just read generously. Do both. I already had a talk with a student today talking about how, like, all the sources she's finding saying, like, Meiji marriage was just a death trap. Okay, but that is... when you read it generously, okay, but then critically break it down, right? Like, was it a death trap? How was it for men and women? How was it compared to marriage at the time, right? You have to actually be critical too. You can't just be too overly generous. And like we already talked about, what I just showed you, use a template for your notes. You need some notation template. Otherwise, you're going to read it and forget it, and you're not going to be able to find it again. How do I know? I forget it, and every professor forgets, because we're humans too. The next one, take useful notes. Do not take notes of everything. It's not all relevant to your topic. And this, again, is why you need a thesis, or at least a very good question. If you don't have a question you're trying to answer, and this is why I pushed you so hard on methodology too. If you don't have a question and then the answer to that question, you have no idea what you're looking for. You can't even look for data. So you're just writing an encyclopedia entry. You're not actually taking notes in an effective way. Now, for some advice she gives here, for example, take notes to advance your thinking, right? So, like, if reading something made you have a thought progress, write that down, and where you got that inspiration. Also, this is important too, she says, record relevant context for each point. So record the context of the quotation. So when you note an important conclusion, record the author's line of reasoning. So understand what their reasoning is too. That's really important. And record the scope and confidence of the statement. Don't make a claim seem more certain or far-reaching than it is. This one's very important. I will grade you based on the certainty and the far-reachingness of your claims. If you say, to use my previous example, all women were virtually dead once they were married. That's a huge claim, folks. A gigantic claim. You have to prove that no women were happy. To disprove you, all I have to show is more than one Japanese woman enjoyed being married and liked her husband. I win. That's all I have to do. So you have to make a reasonable claim. So if you said, like, the Japanese marriage system before the modern age, some marriages were bad. How many is some, though? You have to tell me. Like, okay, 10%. Great. But you're saying 90% of marriages were good marriages or decent. Yes. So you cannot make, but with your authors, when you're taking notes, record the confidence of their claim. Like, what's the original? Is any of it misleading? Keep that in mind. And remember, it can be logically misleading, even if the data, you're not certain about it. And then record how a source uses a statement. Is it an important claim, a minor claim, or a qualification? So again, not everything is their main argument. Keep that in mind. Okay, also, this one is very useful, especially if you haven't started yet. Write as you read. And right next to this trivia, it actually says, don't expect too much from your early writings. If you're new to a topic, some of your early stuff might suck. That's okay. Just start. And many students get really worried about typing everything. I'm going to be honest with you folks. I would highly recommend handwriting a lot of your early things. That's why the note cards are good, but also just have some lined paper and write one paragraph at a time as you read. Handwritten stuff, you actually think through it a lot more, and also, let's be honest, it's way harder to delete. So, something to keep in mind for just good structure. Okay. Now, as you go, now many of you might not be far enough to do this yet, but if you are, it's great. Review your progress. Regularly review your notes and your storyboard. And by the way, earlier on, she recommends having a storyboard. That's what you're making all those cards for, right? So how do you organize your research into something that makes sense? So, for example, full storyboard pages indicate reasons for the support. Empty ones indicate research you still need to do. Is your working hypothesis still plausible? Do you have good reasons for supporting it? Good evidence to support those reasons? Can you add new reasons or evidence? And then her next point, I love it. She's honest enough to say this. When and if to start over. We have urged you to create a storyboard with working hypothesis and a few reasons to guide your research. But some writers start with an idea so vague that it evaporates as they chase it. If this happens to you, search your notes for a generalization that might serve as a working hypothesis. Then work backward to find a question it answers. You might pick a bad hypothesis or a bad question, but this is why you have to just start reading and start noting. And yeah, if somebody says it already happened to them, yes, exactly. That's normal, folks. This is normal for academics. It's normal for humans. This is how research happens. None of us are that brilliant. Most of it is chasing rabbits down holes, and sometimes the hole you find is what different than you expected. Like, for example, I'm writing a book on modern religion in Asia, and I've fallen down a rabbit hole of just Korean religion. I think I have 3 chapters of a book just on Korean religion. Oh my goodness. I am not a Korea specialist, folks. That book, I don't know why it exists, but I have 2.5 chapters written already. That can happen to you. So your original thesis might actually change. Welcome. That's not bad. It's just part of how it goes. So yeah, so how do you if you need to start over, what does she recommend? Well, this is on 61 if you have your book. She says, search your notes for a better answer. Invent the question. And then recategorize and resort your notes. This is why it's good to have a good notation system. If you have a good notation system, you can reorganize the notes instead of just doing everything. And then her last part on page 62, I love this so much, because it's good to remind yourself of this. Manage moments of normal panic. I'm just going to read it. It's such a good section. This might be a good time to address the problem that afflicts even experienced researchers, and at some point will probably afflict you. As you shuffle through hundreds of notes and dozens of lines of thought, you start feeling that you're not just spinning your wheels, but spiraling down into a black hole of confusion, paralyzed by what seems to be an increasingly complex and unmanageable task. The bad news is that there is no sure way to avoid such moments. The good news is that most of us have them, and they pass. Yours will pass too if you keep moving along, following your plan, taking on small and manageable tasks instead of trying to get your head around the whole project. It's another reason to start early. To break a big project into its smallest steps, and to set achievable deadlines, such as a daily page quota when you draft. That one advice, I'm going to give it to you again. Set daily page quotas. All of you have proved you can write my journals. Now you have to do a journal a day, everybody. Give yourself little mini questions that you can try to answer from your sources. Write a paragraph a day. If you wrote a paragraph a day between now and next week, that's 10 paragraphs. You're already well on your way there with no extra writing. A paragraph a day, not a page, just a paragraph. Not like a 5-sentence paragraph, but a real paragraph. If you start it today, you will have 6 pages by the draft time. It's just, that's how it works. Welcome, everybody. All right. So, all right. Any questions so far about engaging sources? Most of this early bit has been about sources and argumentation. And the next slide actually is about planning your argument. We'll talk about that. But any questions so far? Everybody seems fine. Oh, and by the way, if anybody wants to ask, Professor, why didn't you push the paper back further? I have the answer for you, and you'll thank me later. It's so you actually get several weeks to work on your final paper. If you turn it in any later, you're not going to get it back quick enough to make changes. So trust me, you'd rather have more time to make changes than have more time for the draft. It's always better. I've taught this class this is the seventh time. Whenever the draft is later, it's always worse. I would have loved to have it earlier, but the world exploded. So I may be able to get us a slight delay for the final turn-in date, but I have to negotiate with my boss about that. That's a future, not a promise. It's a hypothetical. So in the future, I might, because our original turn-in date is the day of the final. I might be able to get us another half week for your final paper. But no promises. But somebody poke me like next Tuesday and remind me I said that, and I'll have an answer for you about like what my boss let me extend it to. So something to keep in mind. All right. So I didn't see a question pop up. Just to thank you. You're welcome. Trust me, it's better this way. All right. So planning your argument. Some of you have at least started reading, which means you're here. Her chapter 6. How do you plan your argument? So now this is great. She says what a research argument is and what it isn't. Now I already showed you her little formula for how to argue, and it's very useful. But she says this: the word argument has bad association these days, partially because radio and TV stage so many nasty ones. But the argument in a research paper is not like a verbal combat we so often get from politicians and pundits. It doesn't try to intimidate an opponent into silence or submission. In fact, there's rarely an opponent at all. A research argument is like an amiable conversation in which you and your readers reason together to solve a problem. But those readers won't accept that solution until they hear a case for it, good reasons, reliable evidence that ground those reasons, and your response to their reasonable questions and reservations. Bam. So this is it, right? So you're trying to basically reason your way to, like, why do you think reality is this way? Because that's the point of research. We're trying to understand the function of reality. How do humans work? That's the utility. If somebody asks you, because there is a lot of poo-pooing humanities nowadays, the point of humanities, and even if you're in my traditional Asia class, right, the point of trying to understand, like, classic works of literature and history, we're trying to figure out how humans work, because we're humans, and we're going to spend our whole lives working with humans, right? If we don't know how to do it, we're doomed, basically. So that's the point here. That's what we're trying to do. So, all right. Now, again, this second one, build arguments around readers' questions. She says this right off the bat: identify or invent target readers interested in your questions. Try to think of how they would think about it. And if you want an example of that, even today in the office hours tab on Discord, a lot of the questions, if you notice, I typed like 2 whole pages of questions to poor Ellie. Why did I do that? That's exactly the kind of questions that pop into someone's mind with the statement she said. Does that make sense? So those are the questions you should answer in your paper. Not just my questions, but what any reasonable person would have as a question. Now, I think I've done this a lot, so I have a lot of questions I can ask. And again, this is why we have the presentation as part of the class curriculum. It's not to punish you, it's so the other classmates can actually ask you good questions. And by the way, spoiler, are we still doing presentations? Yes, we are going to do presentations through Discord. So you still have to do presentations, but it's actually not a negative, it's a positive. You actually get feedback from other people that they can help you they can totally help you answer. Like, they can ask the questions you should be answering in your paper and help you see what you're missing. Like, that is a big factor of research papers. And that's why a lot of professors, we need camaraderie too. Next, assemble the core argument. So, and like I showed you on this slide, let me get it, this one. I'm going to read what she says. The core of your argument is your claim, aka your thesis. supported by your reasons for believing it and evidence that ground those reasons. It's almost like she invented a great system for doing this. Yes, Turabian's a pretty smart lady. To that core, you will add at least one more element. You must acknowledge and respond to your readers' questions, objectives, and alternate points of view. And then she says, most students find these elements easy to understand when they think of them in light of a predictable question they answer. So, for example, what do you want me to believe? Why should I believe that? How do you know it's true? What about my ideas on this matter? And there's a fifth element, which she breaks down a little bit, and this is on page 66. It's called a warrant. It's less common and more difficult to understand to use. You can build a perfectly adamant arguments without them. Not really, but we'll talk about that. So if you struggle with them, focus on the 4 elements for your readers you'll always expect them to see. We'll talk more about what a warrant is, but warrants are important to have here. But acknowledge your reader's point of view. This is always important. And a reader doesn't just mean me. It means anybody who could read your paper. The other people in your class, for example, right? People in the Asian field. So, acknowledge readers' point of view. Like, somebody's reading this, right? And how might they respond to it? It's not just you in a vacuum, right? And again, we live in the internet age. So, I mean, literally right now, right? I'm broadcasting this to random people. Like, there is actually community people who watch my streams. So they can have objections, right? They might not like my point of view, or they might love it. But they are still there, right? There's that hypothetical other person always reading it. So it's good to keep them in mind, too. All right. Now, the use of warrants. This is a great part. She almost skipped over it, but I don't want to. Let's see. Oh, and if you're having trouble with responding to questions, look at 70 and 71. She actually has like standard forms for acknowledging reader disagreement. It's so useful. Take a look at that. Now, what is a warrant? Well, warrants are assumptions for your questions. So, it's something like, it's the underlying principle of reasoning that should apply to the fact. So remember, I'm forcing you guys to pick a methodology. Your methodology is part of your warrants, right? So what are the assumptions under your questions? And she says on 73, a warrant is a general principle that if one thing is true, then something else must be true. It answers those who believe your reasons are true, but still don't see why they should accept your claim. They think your reasons are irrelevant to believing your claim because they don't know or don't accept the principle of reasoning that connects them. Your warrant in philosophy is what we'd call first assumptions. So there are those assumptions underneath. How can I say it? They're the assumptions underneath your argument. All of us have them, by the way. We just might not see them. Now, if you want to see a full argument, I didn't take a picture of it today. Look at 6.6. This is on page 73. She has a whole argument assembled and then tells you what each bit is. It's just a paragraph, right? But it gives you kind of that aid you might need on how to argue. So if you're having any trouble with argumentation, look at chapter 6, and then that early metric I showed you, the early little formula she made from, I think, chapter 2. Both are very useful. And again, I'm not saying all of us suffer with all of these equally, but it's really good to keep in mind that, okay, if I'm having trouble, am I like an alien, or is this a trouble people have had before? Well, it's a trouble people have had before, I promise. And again, how do I know this? I used to be a student. I still write. Also, I've taught this class multiple times, so I've seen it happen. You're not crazy. All right, any questions about argumentation or the structure of this? I'll give you guys like 30 seconds to ask, because I know there is a little stream lag too. Okay, somebody says, so what exactly is a warrant? Okay, warrants are the assumptions under your questions. Let me give you an example. Somebody yesterday wants to write about women working in Japan in the 20th century and wants to argue about women's equality in work. There's a warrant under that. What is the warrant? The warrant is that equality is possible or desirable. That means one of that student's first principles is equality is an ultimate good, right? That's what a warrant is. So it's that assumption you're making in your question itself. Because, so for example, if I don't believe in equality, I might reject that argument because I don't think equality is an ultimate good. Does that make sense? I still think I'm crazy. You're not crazy. Look at it this way. Okay, somebody says, it's still unclear to me, and I think I'm crazy. Well, think about that argument I just said about equality, right? Not all schools of most schools of philosophy do not see equality as a good. So, for example, some of you in my traditional Asia class, and we studied both Confucius and Plato. Plato has no point for equality. For him, justice, giving every man his due, is more important than equality. He doesn't even have equality in his top 4. Does that make sense? So if you were writing a Platonic paper, equality would, or if you're a Platonist, equality would not be part of your warrant. Same thing with the Confucian, actually, right? If you try to tell a Confucian that a son is equal to their father, it's gibberish, right? Because a father is obviously superior because of the things he's provided. You should... Okay, somebody asks, so do I have to write to prove my warrants, or just realize it changes how people read my research? Look at it like this. Your warrants are already there, and they can be a weakness. So be aware of what warrants you're using and try to defend them. So, for example, if you're making an equality argument, you're basically making like a Marxist argument or a materialist argument. So just see you're using it and at least try to make that in your methodology. Does that make sense? So not your whole paper, but at least your methodology section, you should acknowledge what your warrants are. Now, you might not see them till the end of your paper. That's okay. And again, like I might read your draft and I'll ask you questions about your warrant. For now, don't panic about it, but realize that they are there. And that's a great point, yeah. So imagine, folks, it's like this graphic I showed earlier. Let me get my wonderful handwritten graphic. Most of your college career, you're only dealing with maybe this bottom level and maybe cause and sometimes morals, right? It's very rare you go above that. Does that make sense? So and very, very rarely does a teacher make you choose. Normally a teacher will give you this. Somebody says, so when you say it like that, so examining the warrants could help me find which methodology I should use. Exactly. So warrants lead naturally to your personal inherent methodology. Because we all have kind of the way we view the world. And your methodology is how are you using, what warrants are you using to analyze the world? That's the way to think about it. Are you using materialist Marxist dialectic? Are you using liberal ideas? Are you using a more traditional system? I mean, if you were in my traditional Asia class, there's no reason you couldn't use classical literary critique. Using classical... You could technically use, I've never seen a Confucian paper, but I guess you could, or if you really wanted to do a Platonic or Aristotelian analysis, you could totally do that. Aristotle is an empiricist, and even to a big extent, so is Plato. So you could analyze reality like that if you really wanted to. But yeah, your warrants will definitely lead you to your methodology, for sure. You might not figure it out for the draft, but for the final paper, keep it in mind. That is what you're looking for. Man, good questions. Any other questions? By the way, this isn't even a waste of time. This is the whole point of these slides, is questions like this. So it's perfect. Hopefully around now you'll start to see oh, that's why we've spent 5 weeks or 6 weeks on theory. Yes. But if I just told you what warrants were 6 weeks ago, it doesn't help. You gotta kind of dig through it, and then later you can look back and see, oh yeah, that's what we're trying to do. Oh, that makes sense. All right, I don't see any more questions. Let's keep going. All right, planning a draft. This is the last one we're doing today, except for how to use data. I'm going to show you some modern examples that are a little edgy, so it'll be fun. All right. So for planning a draft, first she says, what are some unhelpful plans? She says, these are great. This is on 75. Do not organize it as a story of your research, especially not as a mystery. With your claim revealed at the end, readers care about what you found, not every step you took to get there. You see the signs of language like this, the first issue, then I compared, and finally. Don't just tell me the way you researched it. Also, do not patch together quotation summaries and sources or downloads from the web. Teachers want to see your thinking, not the thinking of others. That one is quite common, especially people who grew up in East Asia. That's very popular for East Asians in their schools. Also, do not mechanically organize your paper around the terms of your assignment, nor the most obvious elements of your topic. If your assignment lists issues to cover, don't think you must address them in the order given. If you decide to compare and contrast something, avoid organizing your report in the two most obvious parts. Okay, that's the first one. Next, you then have to create a plan, and she says create a plan that meets your reader's needs. And this is where she has her own version of what we talked about already. She says introduction, methods and materials, results, discussion, conclusion. That's one way to organize. And she says converting a storyboard into an outline. She loves outline. And then she gives if you're curious on 77, she gives an outline and then how to do a working introduction. Take a look at 77 if you have your book. She says create a 4-part introduction. So now think of your introduction as having these parts. Current situation, what readers now think or do. Research question, what your readers need to know but don't. Significance of the question. The answer is answering so what, and then what's your answer to it. That's what your readers should know, aka your thesis. So she gives a very extensive breakdown here on how to do a good introduction. Again, I'm not going to do all of it because we only have 15 minutes. So take a look at Turabian. If you don't have it yet, I'm sure you can find a copy online somewhere. That's all I'm going to say. And she also says stuff like this: don't fear giving away your answer. Okay, a couple other drafting advice. This one's really good. I like this advice a lot. I never heard it in college, so I want to give it to you. Identify key terms that unite your paper. So find some terms that throughout your paper occur a lot, and realize actually it's good to have repeating terms. So she calls these the global concepts that unite your whole paper. So it's okay to repeat words in a way that like you have kind of a unifying theme. Think about it this way, right? Like the word selection itself reinforces the point you're trying to make. That's what she's trying to say. So it's good to have this. And also, because we're doing such a long paper, you're going to have 3 different sections. Find key terms in each section. So say you break it down. I like the 3-part breakdown. It's probably the best I've seen in this class. So having an intro, 3 parts, conclusion. So in each of the parts, each section should have its own key terms, and that really helps. Now this one's great. If you have 81, if you have the book on 81, she says some standard principles of order. How the heck should you organize your paper? Well, she has a bunch here, so you should take a look. But like chronological, obvious, right? Easiest. Or part by part. Which parts of the topic are you analyzing? But she has more, right? Short to long, or simple to complex. Familiar to less familiar. Most acceptable to most contestable. Least important to most important, or the other way around. And a step-by-step understanding. There's a lot of ways to organize your paper. Chronological is not the only way. There is other ways to do it. Take a look at this to get some inspiration. And where's this last part? Oh, finally she makes a point here. Is this under Chapter 8? It might be under Chapter 8. Let's see. Oh, in Chapter 8, by the way, we're going to talk about it next class, but Chapter 8 is the drafting your paper. We'll talk about that a little bit next class. But she makes a great point here I didn't want to skip, is write brief intros to each one of your subsections and tie it back into your main thesis. So each one of your subsections also write like a whole paper. Have a little intro, have a little conclusion, use the same format, make sure it ties into the rest of your paper. And then make sure to sketch your evidence and your acknowledgments early. Even if you're not done, kind of guess where you're going to go with it, right? And this is a good way to kind of start planning where you're going to go with your draft. And again, now is a good time to ask me more draft questions. We'll get more into Turabian next class, but for now, that's our Turabian for today. And while you think of questions, I'm going to open a couple links. Here we go. And we're going to do some notes on data. Let's see. No Discord questions. How about stream questions? No stream questions. All right. That might have been the easy one. All right, so now we're going to get into, like, how do we wrestle with data? This one I feel like we don't do enough as a field, and it's a good one to do. So, okay, I'm going to give you some notes on data. Now, these areas aren't my field specifically. Actually, I need one more link open. Here we go. One second, folks. I'm just opening some links to give y'all some fun. All right, and these aren't actually about Asia, but they're interesting kind of data points. Ooh. There we go. Man, at Microsoft Edge, you suck. Okay, here we go. Great. All right, so let's talk about data, folks, before we go. All right, so note on data. You need to use your logic with data. Now, an example, which I'm not... did I have it today? Oh. Last class, I'm out of time. I won't show it today. But we talked about FBI crime data. If you've never looked at it, you should take a look. Now, the interesting thing to note here, people always read crime data for race, because we're kind of race-obsessed right now, let's be honest. I'm not even sure race is a good methodology, but let's not get into that. But the most important thing, if you ever look at crime data, people always like to point out race, but actually age is a big factor. Nobody ever talks about age, if you've noticed. Now I'm going to show you two more sources. They're both from Pew Research. They appeared right next to each other in 2 years apart, and they both have data that Pew refused to cross-correlate, but just having a brain, you can get this data and make an interesting argument. I'm going to show you this data. Okay, watch this. The first piece of data, everybody, this is just age data. That's all this is. The most common age among whites in the U.S. is 58, more than double that of racial and ethnic minorities. So look at this. So this is the white age. Here's Hispanic. Here's black. Here's Asian, multiracial, everybody else. All right. So now then the question is, what's the most common age for every group? Look up here. Whites is 58. Hispanics is 11. Blacks is 27. Asians is 29. Multiracial is 3. Now there's a little boom here for whites, but look at this, right? Millennials. Most Hispanics, blacks, and multiracials and Asians. And Asians are a little older, by the way. But see, there's a little more gradual. The Hispanic and black curves are much more sheer, right? So they have a young age. Everybody can see that, right? Now, why is this interesting? Well, let's see if it still shows up. Does it still show up? Oh, it's gone now. When I first read this was literally in the sidebar. So I want to show you a joke here. You ready? This next one. Blacks and Hispanics face extra challenges in getting home loans. So despite recent improvement, blacks and Hispanics still have a harder time getting mortgages. So look here. 1, 2, 3, whites and Asians. Now, if you only had this data, what do a lot of people say? And this article literally says it. America's racist. Okay, now America could be racist. It's possible. It's possible. However, if you have this data, going back to the other slide, folks, I'm going to ask you a question. Is it easier for a 58-year-old to buy a house or an 11-year-old? Or let's be honest, a 58-year-old or 27-year-old? Or a 58-year-old and a 3-year-old? Now, why am I saying this? Is me not saying, is there no discrimination? I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, if you've never read any other research, you guys got it. If you take my class next semester, we'll do a lot of this in the math class. The number one indicator in the United States, remember how I said crime is correlated to age? Wealth is also the biggest factor in wealth inequality in America is age. No other factor is as important. Age is by far the strongest. Why? Because this guy's been working his whole life. The average Hispanic hasn't even worked yet, and the black guy's only been working for 10 years. How can a guy who worked 10 years have the wealth of a guy who worked 50? Or 40, right? You guys see the difference? So again, is there discrimination? Maybe. But how does an 11-year-old buy a house? And many of you are here in your 20s. Hi, 20s people. Today, in Corona Chan land, what is the chance of a 20-something buying a house in Southern California? Or anywhere, right? High or low? Well, if we were in person, everybody would say, okay, let's be honest, pretty low. Yes. So age is the number one determiner for if you can afford a house and if you have the wealth to buy a house. So, but again, and somebody says this, I'm 27 and there's no way I'm close to buying a home. Exactly. I'm in my 30s, right? I'm in this middle range here. I can't afford a home either, right? So it's the idea that age is the determiner of this much more than race. And again, if you look at the Asians, right, the Asians have a much more steady age curve. See, it's very long and steady and goes down. So it's much more likely age is the correlating factor than race. And this is the same website, same collection of data. So we're not even arguing, is their data good? Let's say we accept the warrant that both sets of data are equally good because they're from the same website, right? They're either equally good or equally ungood, but they didn't put the two together. I did. And that's what research with data is, right? I could write a whole paper now on how actually home inequality isn't real inequality because it's age. That's it. So as the average populations get older, they'll own homes more. And that's literally what this is showing here, right? There's less kids, so the ages are decreasing. I mean, the difference rate is decreasing. You could write a whole research paper about this. I just made a thesis. But here's the thing. They had the data. This is the data, right? But they didn't have that secondary analysis. And that's what we're trying to do with research paper. And I picked this topic because it's interesting, right? So there you go, folks, if you're curious. So that's how data works. Any questions about that? But it's good to keep it... But this stat is often hidden, by the way. I'm going to point this out. Age, that is. Why is age hidden? Why would you hide age, right? Well, if the biggest factor of difference between groups is just age, then I can't agitate you on race. That's why. Just pointing it out, folks. So you can say, Professor, I'm wrong. Great. Now you have to get the age numbers and prove I'm wrong. That's what you have to do. And again, if you can, it's great. It's not my field. It's not my specialty. I'm just using data, and I'm a logical man. So, and again, this is why logic matters. All right. Now, this is good. Another thing to keep in mind, too, is means versus median. Mean is the average. Median is just the most occurring number. That's something to keep in mind, because data can lie easily. If you don't know what the difference is, I'd look it up. Oh, yeah, the other two papers I got. These two papers are quite interesting if you're curious. Earlier on, I mentioned crime. Both these papers are super edgy if you ever do American research. And they almost got ignored, but they're reputable sources, right? It's the Census Bureau and a Harvard professor. One is about race and economic opportunity in the United States from an intergenerational perspective. This one, too, talks about age factors. And it's interesting, and it's a 1989-2015, and it talks about intergenerational poverty and opportunity. Very interesting if you'd like to read it. And again, a lot of this turns out, and they're prestigious institutions, right? Stanford, Harvard, U.S. Census. So, and again, they find data tends to correlate the strongest. This one also has a very interesting, where's that abstract? They talk about poverty between races and men and women. This one's super interesting. So it talks about how like black males are the most hurt group by intergenerational inequality and why it happens. Very interesting. And this one, I brought this one a couple years back. I think it's 2018. Ronald Fryers at Harvard, a very interesting paper, but it's an empirical analysis of racial differences in the use of police force violence. Again, it's very interesting to read. What's the interesting summary of this one? Basically, he found that there's a disproportional number of, what was it? I think he did Houston, and there's a disproportional amount of black men stopped for every crime except for police shootings, and that one was mathematically even to every other group, considering the percentage of the population. Again, it's good to read data to kind of get what arguments are we making from what data, and how can I prove or be disproven by that data. But it's all about how you tackle it. These are just interesting studies I think you should get into, especially if you're talking about crime data. Now, when you're using data and versus arguing a hypothesis and a conclusion based on data, you don't just vomit data at me. You have to kind of connect the lines, like I did with this Pew stuff here, right? So it's good to be like, okay, why does crime happen? Like, if we're talking about the crime stats, but we kind of skipped that today, so don't worry. But like, why is there inequality in getting home loans? You know, it could be race, if I want it to be, but it's more likely age. And I can prove that from these two sources. And is there more? Yes, I have a whole other book, several books actually, that talk about the age disparities. And it's just how it is. So it's, again, this is why it's good to understand the field, so you have enough data. And again, this isn't even my field. This is just me applying logic to a field that's not mine. And I can still find interesting conclusions. And you can too. All right. So if you have questions on that, let me know. I'm happy to answer them. But I want to give us 5 minutes for questions. So conclusion and further reading. Work on your papers. We're going to start Anderson probably end of this next week. Now, if you're having trouble with methodology, I recommend this book as a starting point. History of Western Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. It's a free PDF everywhere online if you search for it, including our library. But if you want to get into utilitarians, liberals, Hobbes is great for political philosophy. Marx, he has little summaries you can kind of refer to. His chapter and book intros, there's 4 of them. They're all great for context, especially the later 2. And please start working on your draft. Now, we're also going to do something that is related to your draft work. We're going to have a journal for next class, which is this one. How would Marx look at your paper? Would he approve or disapprove of the way you're approaching it? Why? And then how can you argue back against him if he doesn't like it? So this will be your journal for next time. And of course, please start drafting now. Write a paragraph a day. Write a paragraph a day. You can do it. Are you busy? Sure. That's part of college, though. So if you haven't already started. If you've already started, fantastic. If you haven't, I highly recommend starting now. I'm now going to give us about 5 to 7 minutes for questions in the voice chat. Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you're a random community person, I appreciate you hanging up. The streams will be available for 2 weeks, and then I'll put them on YouTube and the links on my page. But besides that, thank you all very much. Have a beautiful day. I'll see you next class.